If you always have really tight hip flexors and it doesn't seem to matter how much you stretch them, let's talk about a slightly different strategy we can try to help fix that. My name is John and I am a physical therapist. Now, I can tell you that most people who have really tight hip flexors spend most of their life sitting. When you're sitting, the hip flexor muscles are placed in a shortened position, and then over time it will adapt to that position and lose its flexibility. Now, add the fact that throughout everyday life, most people will never go into a fully stretched position for the hip flexors. These two factors cause that tightness long term. Now, the consequence of this is a lot of back pain, specifically when doing things like running as you kick one leg behind you, or even when standing up or laying down on your back because of the way that the muscle pulls on the back and on the pelvis. So if you don't want that to happen, let's talk about a couple different stretches to help fix that. Now, both of the stretches we're going to talk about use a principle called reciprocal inhibition. What this means, or it's just a fancy way of saying, as you move a joint, the muscle that you activate to move the joint is activated, and then the muscle on the other side of the joint is shut off. So for example, if I do a bicep curl and then I bend my elbow all the way, as my bicep fires, the tricep is shut off. Now this is the body's natural response to movement, because if the tricep did not shut down, not only would I fight the weight as I lift it up, but I'd also fight against the tricep itself in order to lift the arm. So because we can shut off a muscle by activating the muscle on the other side of the joint, we're going to use that same principle when it comes to stretching the hip flexors. Now, starting with what we call the iliopsoas muscle. To stretch this effectively, try and get into a stance where one foot is really far out in front of you, and then keep your chest up. In this position, you might already feel a stretch in the front of the hip that has the leg back. What you can do for an even better stretch is try and squeeze the glute muscle on the side we're stretching. Now, when you do this, you should feel even more of a stretch in front of the hip. This is because the glute is forcing that hip into extension and then further stretching out that muscle. Try and hold the glute squeeze for a few seconds, and then relax for a few seconds, and then repeat that up to 20 times. Obviously, do both legs because we don't want any asymmetries, because then we have a whole new set of problems to deal with. The second muscle that we need to stretch is called the rectus femoris. Now, because I like to do things efficiently, I like to stretch this in a bridge position. Now, we're not just doing a bridge, we're doing a bridge with our feet pulled back towards us as far as possible. So this muscle is both a hip flexor and one of the quad muscles. So that's why we have to bend the knee in order to effectively stretch it. Once your feet are pulled back all the way, you're going to lift your hips up and squeeze the glutes. And again, you should feel a stretch through the front of the hip and then all the way down in the quads. Now, as a bonus, a lot of people tend to think they have a tight hip flexor when they do something like a squat or when they bend the hip all the way, because they feel this pinching or painful sensation in the front of the hip. Generally, this has nothing to do with the hip flexor itself, because if it were tight, you would have an issue in the opposite direction. When the hip is bent, the hip flexor is placed in its shortened position, so a tight hip flexor wouldn't necessarily cause any issues there. This is more so related to hip rotation mobility issues. So a good way to fix that, and I've done this many times, I'll see people who have this pain in the front of their hip, and then we do the specific stretch to put them into what's called internal rotation. Afterwards, when we retest, that painful sensation in the front of the hip is often less or even gone. So to stretch this, get down in kind of a crab walk position, place the leg you want to stretch, or place that foot out to the side. Now, using your muscles, you're going to pull that knee down towards the ground. You should feel a stretch in the hip joint. Now, if it's more than a stretch and it's actually painful, you might need to use or set up a band, hook it around your upper thigh so it's pulling on the upper thigh out, and then do that same thing where you pull the knee down, and that band pulling out should loosen up that hip joint a little bit so that you can do the stretch without any pain. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, I would appreciate if you could hit the like button. Otherwise, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section. And then if you want to subscribe to my channel, I just talk about things that we can do to help build a physically fit and functional body that will last throughout the course of our lives so that we can continue to do the things that we want to.